Moments ago, the political ground beneath Britain began to crack. A single statement from New Delhi sent shockwaves through Westminster, silenced ministers mid-briefing and forced Buckingham Palace into an emergency response. Narendra Modi had struck back, not with tanks or threats, but with words so sharp they exposed a hidden rift between Britain's government and its own values. Within minutes, social media exploded, the cabinet descended into panic, and one question echoed across the nation. How did Britain lose control of the narrative so badly, and why was the king now being dragged into the storm? This crisis did not begin with shouting or spectacle. It began quietly behind closed doors with a deal Britain thought no one would challenge. For weeks, officials insisted relations with India were stronger than ever. Trade talks were on track and tensions were under control. But beneath that calm language, something far more dangerous was unfolding. According to sources close to the negotiations, Britain had pushed too far, too arrogantly, treating India like a junior partner rather than a rising global power. And Narendra Modi noticed. When his response finally came, it was precise, public, and devastating. In a carefully timed address, Modi accused Britain of disrespect, double standards, and moral hypocrisy. Words that landed like a thunderclap across London. Within hours, headlines turned hostile, analysts turned alarmed, and the phrase diplomatic rupture began circulating inside Whitehall. What stunned observers was not just what Modi said, but how he said it. Calm, controlled, unapologetic. He framed Britain's actions as a betrayal of its own democratic ideals, accusing its leaders of preaching fairness while practicing pressure, of invoking history only when it suited them. This was not just a policy dispute, it was a moral indictment. Indian media amplified every line while British ministers scrambled to respond, offering vague reassurances that only deepened the sense of panic. Inside Parliament, MPs demanded answers that no one seemed ready to give. Had Britain underestimated India's resolve? Had pride replaced diplomacy? And most dangerously, had the government provoked a confrontation it could not win? As the political shockwave spread, the public mood shifted from confusion to anger. Social media erupted with accusations that Britain's leadership had embarrassed the country on the world stage. Commentators spoke openly about decline, about a nation still clinging to old assumptions. While the world moved on, protests were discussed, emergency meetings were called. And then came the moment that changed everything. As pressure mounted and the government's response faltered, Buckingham Palace broke its silence. King Charles, usually cautious and restrained, was forced into the spotlight by the sheer scale of the fallout. Palace insiders confirmed the king had been briefed in full, and his reaction was described as deeply concerned. That single phrase ignited a new wave of speculation. When a monarch known for diplomacy signals concern, the nation knows something is wrong. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side stood Modi, projecting strength, clarity, and national confidence. On the other stood a British government, appearing reactive, defensive, and exposed. Commentators began drawing uncomfortable comparisons, questioning whether Britain still commanded respect abroad or whether its voice had grown weaker through miscalculation and internal division. The situation escalated by the hour. Allies asked for clarity. Markets reacted nervously. And behind the scenes, officials feared that this was no longer just about India. It was about Britain's credibility everywhere. Once respect is lost, it is not easily regained. As night fell, one final detail emerged that sent chills through Westminster. Sources suggested Modi's statement was only the opening move, with further revelations and actions being prepared if Britain failed to respond decisively. The implication was clear. This confrontation was far from over. With the king now drawn into the crisis, the government under siege, and public trust rapidly eroding, Britain stood at a crossroads. Would it confront its mistakes or retreat into denial and spin? And if Modi had already struck once, what was he preparing to unleash next? And how far was King Charles willing to go to protect Britain from itself? By the next morning, the situation had deteriorated from diplomatic tension into a full-scale political emergency. Inside Whitehall, senior officials were no longer debating strategy. They were arguing over damage control. Phones rang without pause. Advisors rushed between offices, and ministers who had confidently defended the government's approach only days earlier now avoided cameras altogether. The confidence had evaporated. What replaced it was fear. Fear that Britain had misread the balance of power. Fear that a single miscalculation had exposed how fragile its global standing had become, and fear that Narendra Modi was deliberately forcing Britain to confront truths it had long refused to face. As more details emerged, the scale of the humiliation became clearer. Leaks suggested Britain had attempted to apply quiet pressure during trade discussions, assuming India would eventually concede for the sake of access and legacy ties. That assumption collapsed the moment Modi spoke. His response reframed the entire conflict. He presented India not as a petitioner, but as an equal, even a moral superior, unwilling to be lectured by a country still struggling with its own political instability. This narrative caught fire. International commentators echoed it. Former diplomats warned that Britain's era of easy influence was over. And across the UK, the public began asking uncomfortable questions about who was really in charge and whether the nation's leaders still understood the world they claimed to govern. The pressure on King Charles intensified as the hours passed. While the monarch is constitutionally neutral, moments like this test the invisible boundaries of that neutrality. Reports surfaced that the king had requested additional briefings, not just from government officials, but from independent advisors with experience in Commonwealth relations. That detail mattered. It suggested concern not only about policy, but about Britain's moral posture, its reputation as a fair, respectful partner rather than a coercive one. Royal watchers noted the silence from the palace was no longer passive. It was deliberate. And in British politics, deliberate silence from the monarch often speaks louder than words. Meanwhile, Narendra Modi's allies continued to escalate the pressure. Indian officials hinted that cooperation in other areas could be reconsidered if Britain failed to change its tone. Markets responded instantly. Analysts warned of long-term consequences for trade, investment and strategic alignment. What began as a political dispute now threatened to bleed into the economic bloodstream of the country. Every delay, every vague statement from British leaders deepened the sense of drift. The opposition seized the moment, accusing the government of recklessness and arrogance, arguing that national pride had been sacrificed for short-term political theatre. Outside Parliament, the mood darkened. Comment sections filled with anger and embarrassment. Citizens spoke openly about decline, about leaders obsessed with optics, while the foundations cracked beneath them. Comparisons were drawn to past crises where Britain had overestimated its leverage and paid the price. This time the symbolism was sharper. Modi represented a confident rising power with a clear sense of direction. Britain, by contrast, appeared divided, defensive, and unsure of its own identity. The story was no longer just about India versus Britain. It was about the future of British influence itself. Late that evening, another development sent shockwaves through political circles. Sources claimed the king had expressed private frustration at being placed in such a position, forced to react to a crisis born not of necessity, but of misjudgment. That revelation changed the tone entirely. A rift between the monarchy's sense of duty and the government's handling of foreign affairs would represent a profound moral fracture at the heart of the state. The unspoken question now hovered over every newsroom and briefing room in the country. If this crisis continued to escalate, would King Charles remain a silent observer? Or was Britain approaching a moment where the Crown would feel compelled to act? And what would that mean for a government already struggling to stand its ground? By the third day, the crisis had fully escaped the control of the government and taken on a life of its own. What began as a diplomatic dispute was now a national reckoning, exposing fractures that had been quietly widening for years. Inside Westminster, senior figures spoke in hushed tones about survival rather than solutions. Confidence votes were whispered about. Emergency reshuffles were discussed. The language of power had shifted from certainty to containment. Every statement issued by the government felt reactive, as if Britain was no longer shaping events but desperately chasing them. And looming over it all was the growing sense that Narendra Modi had not only challenged British authority but outmanoeuvred it on the world stage. Modi's second move confirmed those fears. Without raising his voice or escalating his rhetoric, he allowed the consequences to speak for him. Strategic pauses in cooperation were announced. Symbolic meetings were postponed. The message was unmistakable. Respect was no longer assumed. It had to be earned. This approach proved devastating. It left Britain with no dramatic confrontation to rally against, only a slow, grinding exposure of weakness. International observers began describing the episode as a turning point, a moment when Britain's post-imperial assumptions finally collided with a new global reality. And at home, the public could feel it. The unease was no longer abstract, it was personal, a sense that something important had been lost and no one in power was willing to admit it. The King's position became increasingly central as the government's authority wavered. Constitutional experts debated scenarios that had not been seriously discussed in decades. What happens when the Crown's moral responsibility appears stronger than the government's political judgment? What happens when silence itself becomes a form of pressure? Reports suggested King Charles was deeply aware of the historical weight of the moment. As a monarch who has spent his life championing dialogue, balance and respect between nations, this crisis cut to the core of his values. Insiders described him as calm but resolute, determined not to allow Britain's reputation to be permanently damaged by short-sighted decisions. That resolve, however quiet, sent a clear signal. The era of consequence-free miscalculation was over. Public reaction intensified. Demonstrations were planned. Petitions circulated. Media outlets that had once defended the government now questioned its competence openly. The phrase national embarrassment dominated headlines. More troubling was the shift in tone among Britain's allies, who began urging restraint and reflection rather than offering support. That absence spoke volumes. Britain was being watched, not followed, judged, not trusted. And at the centre of it all stood a government facing a truth it could no longer avoid. Power without credibility is illusion, and illusion shatters quickly under a pressure. As night fell, a final revelation emerged that reframed the entire crisis once again. Sources hinted that behind the scenes, quiet channels between the palace and foreign counterparts were being explored, not to undermine the government, but to prevent further damage to the nation itself. The implications were staggering. If true, it would suggest that Britain's traditional safeguards were activating in response to a perceived failure of leadership. The balance between Crown and government, so carefully maintained for generations, was being tested in real time by global forces that respected strength and clarity above all else. Britain now stands at a defining moment. The confrontation sparked by Modi has become a mirror, reflecting not just diplomatic missteps, but deeper questions about identity, leadership and moral authority. Can the government regain control before trust erodes completely? Will King Charles be forced into a more visible role to protect the nation's standing? And as the world watches closely, one question grows louder with every passing hour. Is this crisis the beginning of Britain's renewal, or the moment its long decline finally became impossible to deny? As dawn broke over Westminster, it became impossible to pretend this was still a temporary storm. The crisis had hardened into a defining chapter, one that would be studied long after the headlines faded. Inside government buildings, the mood was no longer frantic, but heavy, almost resigned. Senior figures understood that something fundamental had shifted. Britain was not merely responding to Narendra Modi's challenge. It was confronting its own reflection. Years of confident language, carefully staged summits and symbolic gestures had collided with a world that now demanded clarity, strength and consistency. And in that collision, Britain had faltered. What unsettled officials most was the growing belief that Modi's intervention had exposed more than a diplomatic weakness, it had exposed a moral vacuum. The accusation of hypocrisy cut deeper than any economic threat. Britain, a nation that prides itself on fairness and democratic principle, was now being accused, credibly, of using pressure where it once used persuasion. That narrative spread rapidly beyond India. Editorials across Europe and North America echoed the same theme. Britain's voice sounded louder than its authority, its warning sharper than its influence, and once that perception takes hold, it is brutally difficult to reverse. The King's quiet presence loomed larger with each passing hour. While no public statement was issued, subtle signals continued to emerge. A postponed engagement here, a carefully worded briefing there. Each move was analysed, dissected, and interpreted as a sign that the palace was weighing its responsibilities not just to the constitution, but to history itself. Veteran observers noted that King Charles had lived through moments like this before, times when governments came and went, but the consequences of their choices lingered. The Crown's role, they argued, was not to intervene hastily, but to endure wisely. Yet endurance does not mean indifference, and the line between restraint and responsibility was beginning to blur. Meanwhile, the government's attempts to regain control only deepened the sense of drift. Statements were issued promising reset talks and renewed cooperation, but they lacked conviction. They sounded like echoes of a world that no longer existed. The public felt it. Polls showed a sharp drop in confidence, not just in leadership, but in Britain's direction as a whole. This was no longer about one deal or one dispute. It was about whether the nation still understood its place in a rapidly changing order, whether it could adapt without losing its soul, whether it could speak firmly without forgetting humility. International reaction continued to evolve. Some allies remained cautiously supportive, while others quietly adjusted their expectations. Doors did not slam shut, but they no longer swung open either. In diplomacy, that subtle shift is often the most damaging. Access delayed, calls unanswered, invitations quietly withdrawn. These were the invisible costs of misjudgment, the kind that do not spark immediate outrage, but erode influence over time. Modi's strategy appeared brutally effective, not to isolate Britain, but to let it feel the weight of its own assumptions. And yet, within this pressure, a different possibility began to surface. Some voices argued that this crisis could still become a turning point, not of decline, but of reckoning, that being challenged publicly by a confident global leader might force Britain to rediscover the values it so often invoked. Honesty over image, respect over leverage, partnership over posture. Whether the current leadership was capable of that transformation remained deeply uncertain. What was clear was that time was running out. As night fell once more, the nation waited for a decisive response, for a moment of clarity, for leadership that matched the gravity of the hour. The silence felt heavier than any speech, charged with expectation and unease. Britain stands suspended between past and future, watching as the consequences of one confrontation continue to unfold. And the question now haunting every corridor of power is this: when the next move comes, will it restore Britain's standing, or will it confirm that the moment to change has already slipped away?